Welcome, Christine, and welcome everybody who's joining us live. Thank you so much for agreeing to do the free webinar. We really appreciate it.
Oh, aloha, everyone. And I'm honored to be asked to do this. So I find they're always new and interesting. So I love it, actually.
Yeah, we'll see what comes up today.
Yeah.
So for a brief introduction, Christine met Sydney Banks all the way back in 1981 and began sharing the principles as soon as you were impacted by them, it sounds like. And she's a co-founder and executive director of the Hawaii Counseling Education Center. And she set up one of the first 3 principled clinics in the world. And Christine let me know that she's been practicing marriage and family therapy since before they even had licenses for it. So you're very seasoned in the profession.
Yeah, I was very young then. I was 14.
That's right. They let teenagers do therapy.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Back then, they did have a lot of people doing therapy that were not very trained. That's true. Close.
Yeah. Well, welcome. And so Christine, you and I will just chat for a little bit, and then we can open up for Q&A from everyone else who'd like to share reflections or have questions for you. But I'd love to start out by just hearing about your experience of meeting Sydney Banks way back in 1981, kind of what led up to that and how it all unfolded, if you'd be willing to start there.
Yes, absolutely. 1980, actually, I was had been a therapist for about 6 years, and I was really burned out. I was like extremely crispy around the edges and pretty angry. And at the time, I was a feminist therapist, and I was a feminist family therapist and worked almost exclusively with families where there was sexual abuse and physical abuse and victims of some kind of trauma. And at that time, there was like nobody else doing it, so it was kind of new. And the kind of therapy I did was really trying to connect with people's pain and suffering as a way to make them feel better. I'm not sure why, but that was kind of the bent that I took. So I got really stressed out. And the other thing is that I realized my clients would get a little bit better, but they weren't happy. And I wasn't happy. And all the other professionals I worked with, because I set up my first clinic when I was 27. And so there was 8 therapists that worked in that clinic with me, and none of them were happy, and most of them were on antidepressants. And so I kind of was like, okay, what's up with this? This whole thing is a bunch of crap, because people are not getting into a better feeling, and I'm not, so I'm going to get out of this business. But I was also, I was 30, and I was definitely wanting to get married. And so I decided that perhaps going to psychology conferences would be a better place to meet a man than bars, because I kept finding alcoholics in bars. I'm not sure how that worked, but it was not very successful for me. And in those days, we didn't have online dating. We didn't have other ways to meet people. So that's generally the way that people did that. So I went to this conference only because everybody else in my clinic was going. And then I came up with this idea that if I could meet a psychologist or a social worker, that would be better. So I went to hear Dr. Roger Mills, who is one of the founders of this work. And he had come up and was talking about this new way of looking at people. And this was before we even talked about the 3 principles. So he was just basically talking about how reality is created from the inside out. And I was the person in the audience that you hate to have there, that's asking all the argumentative questions and is really not very interested in learning anything. And so I proceeded to do that most of the morning. And then during that at lunch break, we all kind of were sitting together people from my clinic kind of bad-mouthing this as like, this isn't anything new. We do this too. It's all fine. And when I got up from the table, and I had a kind of a weird experience, it was kind of like, when you watch TV and the main character continues walking and everybody else gets stuck in time. And that happened to me. I turned around and thought, oh, weird. And I turned back around, and I happened to be going out the door with Roger Mills. And he said to me, I didn't answer your questions very well, did I? I said, no, as a matter of fact, you didn't. And then by this time I found out he was single, right? So now the bait was there. So I'm thinking, okay, I gotta listen so I can have a conversation with him in case dinner is gonna happen, right? So I'm like trying to be nice and listen, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I mean, he would talk to me and it would like go over my head, and then I'd try to figure it out, and I couldn't. So I went back in the afternoon and I thought, okay, now I really got to listen, because this is a possibility that I'm going to have dinner with this guy, and I don't want to sound like I'm stupid. So he was talking, and now in those days in therapy, being positive in therapy was considered bad therapy. It's like you were a religious therapist, and if you did that, and you were not paying attention to people suffering and their pathology, and that was not considered good therapy. So he was talking about focusing on the positive, right? And I thought, positive, I could do positive. Now, during that time, that was not me. I was not known by anybody as positive, but that seemed like something I could like get behind a little bit. And then we broke for a break, and there was a physician there. And I went up to him and I said, well, what do you think about this stuff? He said, well, it makes good common sense to me. I thought, well, if a doctor thinks this is good, because at the time doctors were one step down from God, and if the doctor thinks this is good, maybe I should listen. So Roger put up this diagram, and for whatever reason, I had a huge shift. It's like all of a sudden I realized that I was doing life backwards, and that I was seeing my own thoughts in my life, and that all the stuff that I was trying to work out in therapy and trying to deal with in my own life was coming from me. And that shift was so dramatic that I changed so much that people thought that I was either on drugs, I met a man, or I joined the Moonies, which at the time was that Sun Yat Moon had this cult thing, right? So those are because no one had seen anyone change that much. I mean, just like we just didn't have clients that changed in that way. So long story short, I had signed up for both days. The second day was optional because the first day was, I didn't want to like meet somebody the first day and then not be signed up for the second day. So it looked like I was doing it on purpose. And so I signed up for both days, and I went the second day, and I could tell when I walked in the room, everybody was like, oh God, not her again. And I had some really, really bad families that I was working with. And I said to him, I said, well, so this will work for anybody. Like, this would work for this case. And Roger said, yeah, sure, they're just people. It'll work for anybody. I was like, oh, okay, great. And I got into the best feeling I'd been in years. It's so much so that my cheeks hurt from smiling too much. You know, I had to kind of like do that with him. And it was, I mean, I was like laughing every day. Every day something would happen. I got kicked out of a supervision group that I set up because I was doing work with this other psychologist, and she went to the same training, but she didn't hear it. And so I was like, one of my clients said it was like I went into light speed over her. So I was like, whoosh, and she was like, meh. So she wanted to confront me on this in supervision, and that's the supervisor of the group at the time. I have to laugh at this because she said to me, she said, well, what are you doing, Chris? And I said, well, it's positive. And she said, okay, you can't be in this group. And she kicked me out of the group, never talked to me again. Any of those people that I'd been friends with didn't talk to me again. So that's how different this was at that time. Like the world has kind of come along, the field has come along quite a bit since then. So after that, now I'm in this great feeling, and I knew I needed to get more. Like I knew that whatever it was I saw wasn't deep enough, but man, it was like so good. In fact, my own personal therapist made me come back a month later because she thought I had a hysterical conversion. And so I went back and I started, she goes, I don't know, it seems like it's real to me. I said, well, it's real, it's real. So I signed up for this 3-week course down in Florida at the Advanced Human Studies Institute. And I went down there, and the first 2 weeks basically were me calming down because I was still going, I mean, really, really fast. And I would go, I stayed out by the beach, and I'd take a bus in to the center, which I thought was this big center, and it turned out to be like 3 rooms. I'd have my time with each one of the Roger Mills and Enrique Suarez, and then I'd go back. And it took about 2 weeks of doing that before I slowed down. All of a sudden, one day I got up, I thought, I can't go into it. I just have to just sleep. And I slept the whole weekend. And then I got up on Monday, and I was in this really, really nice feeling. Like I finally got it, what they were talking about. I thought that feeling I was in, that was kind of this, I would say, kind of a positive feeling, but not a deep positive feeling, was what we were talking about. And I realized as I was there, because there were these nurses that had learned this from Dr. Suarez at the vet center, and they were walking around in this feeling like, I'd never seen people like this before. It was amazing to me. And then when I got up that morning, I thought, oh, this is what they're talking about. So it just happened that week, Sydney Banks was there on vacation. And so I was invited to come to hear him speak at Dr. Mills's house. So I went there, and I'm like waiting, very like, oh my gosh, what's he gonna look like? Is he gonna have a turban on his head? You know, is he gonna be like walking on water, or, you know, on air or something? Like, I just didn't know what to expect. I was from a farm community in Minnesota. We just didn't do enlightenment much. And so like, this was something I'd never even been mildly interested in. And when he walked in, what I remember thinking was that he's just a regular guy. He's just a really regular guy. He's nothing special. But there was something about him, there was a feeling about him, that you could feel the quietness and the calmness of his mind. And that I was like drawn to like a magnet. And so he talked, and I remember the whole time he was talking, the first time I'm thinking, don't think about it. Don't think about it. Just listen. Because I was, as a therapist, you're really trained to be thinking while the person is talking. And I had the hardest time really quieting down to listen and just really connect with that. And so after that, I was kind of like, I had no idea what he said, to be honest with you. I had no idea what he said. And I didn't care, because I knew that there was something in me that knew what he was talking about. So I went home that night, and then they called and said, he'd like to spend some time with you. I was like, oh my God, no, I can't do that. And so I said, oh, sure, okay. And so this place had this little restaurant that was right on the water that he particularly liked the grouper at. And so he and Roger came down, and the only thing I remember was that, just listen, Chris, just listen. And he talked about nothing. He talked about nothing. We just had lunch with him. And he was talking about, I think he was talking about how he was putting up wallpaper in his house. That was his big thing for a while. He was into wallpaper. And he would talk about the ordinary stuff in life in a way that was riveting. It was just like the most incredible feeling when he talked about nothing. So I thought, well, that was really nice, but I wish he would have talked about, what this is, and helped me with it a little bit, because I still don't get it. So then the next couple days later, he said he wanted to go to the swap meet, or the farmer's market. Here we call it farmer's market, but I think it was swap meet. It's a place where people come and sell their stuff, which I wasn't a swap meet girl. This was not my thing, to go look at other people's junk in my mind. So I said, but I wanted to hang out with them as much as possible. So we went, and he would be walking along, looking at stuff. And all of a sudden he'd say, oh, look at that. And he'd find this gem of a really beautiful antique in the middle of a bunch of junk. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. Isn't that interesting? Because I'd walked by it already and come back and hadn't even seen it. So it was like walking with him, with somebody that was that present. It made it seem like in your mind you were screaming. Your thoughts were like so evident. This, like, at least in my mind, it was this experience of my own thinking around someone who was in that quiet of a place. Now, you guys are probably a lot quieter than I was at the time I learned this, but it was amazing to me what I learned about myself without him saying anything. So, I mean, I learned right away that if I just listened, I would learn something deeper. I'd see something deeper. But if I was thinking and trying to impress him, which some people did, it didn't go over very well. So it was from that point on, then I went back to Minnesota, and he called me up one day and he said, "Dearie, would you like me to help you?" And I was like, "Yeah, and, yeah, sure, you know." And he said, "Okay, so just be you." And I remember thinking to myself, like, who the heck is that? I've been looking for that for 30 years. I have no idea what that is. He said, "Just be you. Just be ordinary." I thought, okay, ordinary, I can be ordinary. That's good. And honestly, he couldn't have said the more perfect thing to me, because I always thought I was special in a negative way, like somehow I was not as smart as people, not as pretty as people, not as blah, blah, blah. And just to be a regular person and be okay with that, trusting that somehow I would get that wisdom would come to me from that. So that was the beginning of him mentoring me, which went on for the rest of his life anyway.
Yeah, oh, that's really beautiful. And who knew what looking for a husband was, where that was going to take you?
Really. I got this out. I thought I'd share this with you. So before I learned this was my coffee cup. I can't see me, so can you see it?
Yes.
Can everybody see
yeah.
it? Yeah. This was like I love this guy. It was like this was me. So then I didn't even think about doing this, but I put it away and I was drinking my coffee cup. Now, out of this, my girlfriend gave me this cup. Now, over the years, the handle broke off, but you see the difference in the feeling on this? Like, that's a transformation, right? Mm-hmm. And I didn't do anything to make that happen. It just came as a result of that insight. So it was funny, one day I was drinking my coffee and doing a group, and we were talking about the change in a feeling in a person, and somebody had brought me flowers. One of my clients had brought me flowers to put in here, and I looked up and I saw my old self, right? I said, okay, look, this is the difference in a feeling.
Oh, that's what a great metaphor.
Yeah.
And I love that you have both of those mugs still.
Yeah, well, believe me, I saved that. I thought this is forever.
Yeah. And in terms of your work as a therapist, how did that unfold for you you had a dramatic personal shift, and how did that show up in your work with clients?
Well, the first thing that happened was I was kind of a big name in the family violence therapy community, which at the time was this big thing. Everybody was starting to get into it, right? And so the word kind of went out in the community that Chris Heath is flipped out. So people would call me and they'd say, "We heard you flipped out." I said, "Well, if this is what flipping out is, you ought to try it, because I feel better than I felt in a long, long time." And my clients, I hate to say this, but I had 65 clients a week. This person had 65 clients a week. And I had mostly groups, women's groups. And so now one of the things I did, now this is again, I'm going to date myself, but doing that many case notes in 1 week would be a lot of work. So I would have the group members write their own note, and then I'd add a little bit to it, so it would be my note. And up until that time, people talked about how they were upset with their mother and their parents were mean to them, and they had all these problems with relationships, and they had really low self-esteem, and nothing would go right, and frequently they had alcohol and drug problems. And that Friday, I went to the training, and on Monday, their case notes changed. Now, I wish I'd kept those case notes, really, because it was dramatic. That it was all outside in, poor me, I'm suffering. And that day, it became hopeful, it became positive. People started to talk about relationships coming together. I went to 7 weddings that year of those, because these women had been with me for many years, many of them. And it was just this, like everything I wanted for them to have happened, only we didn't work on it. So it was like just shifting that around and then seeing how easy it was for people to change. So of course what happened then is all of them were changing. So that went out into the world, and people would send people to my clinic hoping they would get this new therapy. And what would happen is that referral would come in, they wouldn't ask for me directly, and they'd get with somebody else. And I talked to Joe Bailey then, who was also in the same building. And we talked about then setting up a clinic that was just based on the principles. And truly, I think actually it was the very first true clinic that was based on the principles. But one of the things that would happen, I mean, it was funny, my other colleagues, because I mean, they saw me at my worst. I mean, I was pretty crazy. And I mean, I wasn't pretty crazy. I was very, very emotionally reactive, very out there. And so they came to me. Well, 2 things happened. One is that we shared this waiting room. And so there was all these little offices around the waiting room. And so my clients would be, and we'd be doing group, and there'd be peals of laughter, and people would be laughing and having a great time. And so their clients would go to them and say, what kind of therapy is she doing in there? And so then they started getting really insecure, like, what was I doing? And this was so different, and blah, blah, blah. And so between that and people not getting to me, we decided to set up this other clinic. And before we did, they kind of had a little intervention with me. And they were going to tell me that what I was doing was crazy, even though they had nobody even asked me what I was doing. They didn't ask me to know more or anything. And I said, look, you guys, you have to admit I'm in a better state of mind. And if I'm in a better state of mind, you know I have to be doing better therapy, even if you don't know what it is or it's different or new. And they couldn't argue with that. You know, they kind of let it go, but I'm sure were quite happy when they decided to move out and set up a separate clinic, yeah.
And in that new clinic, did you start training therapists at that new clinic as well?
Mm-hmm. We had started already. This was about a 2-year period that I was still at the other clinic. And so a lot of people, especially people that were in the addiction field, because both Joe and I had been working with addictions. And so there was a lot of people that kind of heard about it and were interested, that they were just drawn to it like, you know, a bee to honey. And so we started doing some training groups, and then the people that were kind of the most, had the biggest shift themselves, we hired them to come and work with us. So we had a group of about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe about 6 or 8, somewhere between 6 to 8 of us. And yeah, it was. And you know, the whole time, Sid told us, he said, this is going to go out in psychology. It's going to go out in psychology. So I'm like, what are we doing wrong? There's no psychologists here. This is not and I thought, duh, this is still going out in psychology. So that was kind of the early route that it went.
Yeah. And then what took you to Hawaii?
It was one of those learning moments for me. We had a social worker intern that was, I think she was into like reading auras or doing something I thought was kind of goofy. And I had a session with her that I was pretty harsh with her, I think. And so she was crying and didn't feel good about it. And so Joe said, you know, Chris, you got to lighten up on people. And I was like, oh gosh. So I went home and cried for 3 days. And then called Sydney Banks, and I said, I shouldn't be the director of this clinic. I'm harsh with people, and I'm negative, and I'm... And he said, now, dearie, he said, sometimes we get in a low mood, and sometimes we get in a very low mood like you are right now. He said, now, if there's something you need to change about yourself, then change it, and then forget it. And I think you're bored. Maybe you should move to Hawaii and set up a clinic. It was just like, oh, what a great idea. So I didn't like Minnesota winters. As dry as I might, I couldn't like love them. And so I talked 3 other women into moving to Hawaii. And so we moved to Hawaii without knowing anybody here, which if I'd known now, if I would say that now, I would say, oh, no way. But we set up a clinic, and then we put a brochure out talking about our philosophy and how we worked with people. And somebody in one of the health centers liked it and told us to apply for a grant. And we did. And over time, it's morphed and changed. And it was up to, I had 62 employees at one time, and had a contract with the state. And then they decided they were going to tell me how to do therapy. And I said, no. And so we scaled back down. And now I have, working with me, I have 2 psychologists, 2 mental health counselors, 2 marriage and family therapy, and 3 postgraduate marriage and family therapy students. So mainly I'm focusing on marriage and family therapy training now. It's my thing.
That's great.
Yeah.
And in that training, what do you see now as the key things that you would like, therapists to take on board?
Well, personally, I think that the hardest thing for people who have been trained traditionally is to get out of the information application mode, where they're listening to problems and trying to analyze things. And it's kind of a dance, because people come in thinking that that's what they need, right? And so they frequently that's what comes out of their mouth at first. So the dance is learning how to shift them over to seeing that they can focus on being healthy, and those things tend to change. But I think that the hardest thing for students is to navigate that, having one foot in one world and one foot in the other world. So I would say drop the old world and immerse yourself in the principles, and don't look back. You'll look back, but try not to hang on to anything. I know when I first learned this, I thought, well, I do some of this. I mean, I do this. And honestly, I couldn't have been farther from it. But I mean, I loved people. I really wanted them to be healthy. And I saw the health. And that's why I became a marriage and family therapist, because marriage and family therapy was looking at people as being a product of their interactions, rather than this pathological sick person that needed medication. But that was about as far as it went. And then, it's like, it's just that kind of sometimes intellectual draw we have to kind of talk about what's wrong and then try to fix it.
Yeah. So unlearning that.
Yeah. Missy is on. She's one of my.
Oh, is she on here?
Now she's on. She can maybe tell me what she thinks too.
Yeah.
You want to add anything, Misty?
Let me find her and I'll unmute. There you are. Hi, Misty. Oh, have I unmuted you?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Hi.
There you are. Hi.
Yeah, so working under Chris is always an honor, because Chris tells it like it is at all times. And one of the things that you get to learn working under Chris is your oxygen mask first, and that you have to be in a space that you can listen, and that comes from being grounded. What I really love about what I just heard Chris share was about, leaving the past behind you, being in the world, the graduate world versus the 3P world. You can find that difficult. I can find that difficult to navigate, and knowing when to quiet down and be grounded is, oh gosh, it's primal. It has to become a part of living, just like breathing.
What do you think, though, Lucy? What do you think was the hardest thing for you to when you started learning about the principles to let go of or to make a shift with?
Oh, listening.
Mm.
Yeah, listening, totally, because your skills of doing have been what you navigated everything with, and listening to do nothing was, it just felt like, oh, that was the shift for me. That was the shift for me. The very first time that I met Chris, it was just like this, and she said, no, absolutely not. Do it like this. And I went, oh, and it was this immediate moment of listening. Just be. And so sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's kind of the first step is really being able to let go of your all the training that you have just to be a person with your client.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so key. Thank you, Missy. Thanks so much for sharing. I see that we have, Tom has his hand raised, so I'm going to go to Tom next. And I just want to let everybody know, because I can't see all of you at once, if you would like to ask Chris a question, or if you have a reflection you'd like to share, please click the participants button and then click the raise hand button, and then I'll see that your hand is raised and I'll be able to unmute you. So hi, Tom.
Hi, Rohini.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Tom.
Nice to meet you. You know, I think I lived in Minnesota some of the same time you were there.
Oh, you did? When was that?
I was like 1990 through 2005.
I know, I was in Hawaii by that time.
Oh, okay. Well,
I moved to Hawaii in 1985.
okay.
But then I came back to Minnesota in 2001 for about 9 years.
Okay. Well, I was there for a few of those years. I'm still fairly new to the principles, but one of the things that is really, I just find myself feeling a lot is feeling gratitude for so many of the like early pioneers who brought this to the world. And I think I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, I really appreciate that. And that feeling of gratitude, that's like the best, isn't it? And I'm really grateful to Sydney Banks that he not only discovered it, but then saw that he wanted to share it with the world. And on the other hand, I also know that you don't have a choice. You know, it's like when you see it, it's like it just comes out of you, right? And so there were times when we were terrified, let me tell you, because we had dreams of people coming to lynch us and do all kinds of things. Because we knew that we could see that what we were doing was really different, and you just couldn't be caught up in what people thought of you. And that was probably the hardest thing, I think, for any of us, because you know, people would say like, you guys are crazy and this is a cult and da da da. We like, really? No. But yeah, it didn't feel like there was a choice though. It's just like, okay, figure this out. But yeah, that I'll tell you, that gratitude. Yeah. I mean, I just saw a family this weekend here. I did an intensive with a young boy who was getting so upset that he was beating his parents up, and I was so grateful that I'd learned this, because they'd been to every therapist on Oahu and nothing had been helpful to them. And being able to share this, I remember the mother sat back in her chair and she said, oh, this is really different. I said, yes, it is very different, and the results are going to be different. And that feeling of gratitude is just your own seeing what you're seeing, yeah?
Yeah, I appreciate you're saying that too, because sometimes I think just when questions come up, they don't really need as many to be answered, but just having the gratitude is really nice. So I appreciate your pointing that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it had nothing to do with any of us, believe me. It was what was coming through us. Because if it was really on us to have this come out in the world, it wouldn't have come. Because we did everything possible to mess it up.
Yeah, I suppose. And sometimes I find myself thinking, wow, I knew about this when I lived in Minnesota, and Joe Bailey and other were there, but it just came at the right time, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
So,
a timing to things. I always think that people are kind of like popcorn. You heat them all up at the same time, and some of them pop right away, and some of them wait till you take them off the heat, and some of them you got to put back in again.
that's great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Rohini.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. So I don't see any other hands raised. So if anybody has any other questions, just, oh, hang on, Misty. Let's see, I think you can, sorry, I'm not reading the chat. So yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add that sometimes, sorry, it's a little bit of a kickstart for my brain. I was just going to add that what I have learned from Chris and in the principles, I had a certain perception of ego, and I have learned that ego has everything to do with both sides of being both coaching and being a therapist. When I am not listening, I'm in my ego. When I am reacting, I'm in my ego. And that's something that I know the principles really keep me
That's
when I fall into.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really kind of important point, because normally in traditional therapy, you're really focused on what the client is doing and what they're kind of eliciting out of you, right? So they become difficult clients, or they become people that are have a certain diagnosis, right? You're like, oh, that's borderline. She's so borderline. We tend to look at people as them doing it to us. So we kind of have to be more secure in sessions and come across sometimes in a way that's very interesting. But the other piece with that is that I think to me, one of the big differences that people need to see is how to listen for the health in people, as opposed to listening for the problems that people have or what's off with them. So listening for the health, you're like always seeing like how their own innate wisdom is coming through, and how they have times when they're in mental well-being, and you got to get a feel for that. You have to really be listening for it, and you have to be listening for it in yourself, so that you can see in yourself how your wisdom is coming through, and how it is, how it comes through in people, even if they're in a really low state. Like this little boy that I was meeting with was kind of hallucinating, or at least he thought he was hallucinating, and he was in a very awful place. He'd like beat his parents up, he'd get so frustrated, and he was in a really low level of consciousness. And I was talking to him kind of like, I thought pretty lightly about the principles. And he looked at me and he said, "You mean that all mental illness is just thought?" I was like, whoa. I said, now that would be your wisdom. That's what I was talking about, that came from you, because I didn't even mention that. And so being able to see that in people, and looking at even, the way that they interact, or their kind of bad behavior, as their best shot at trying to find that good feeling. That's a really different way of listening to a client.
Yeah, that's really powerful, and it's so refreshing also on the therapist or the coach side to be able to be looking for that. And I think for me, that was one of the biggest shifts, whether it was with clients or with myself, was to recognize that there was a wisdom in all of it. And that if I wasn't seeing it, that was only my judgment that was showing up. So it was like a huge 180. And then when you started, you were saying how you were so burnt out after just 6 years of doing the work. And I would imagine working from this understanding in this way, that that's not even an issue at this, you know, in your experience.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what Misty was referring to, that I'm kind of Attila the Hun when it comes to the mental well-being of my staff. And I don't, like, you can't really teach somebody something that you don't know. So if you're depressed, how can you teach somebody who is depressed not to be depressed? Because if you knew how to be not depressed, you wouldn't be depressed. Nobody that gets depressed wants to be depressed, right? And so it's really seeing that you have to, and that's a huge difference, isn't it? Like, you know, you could be a behavioral therapist and be totally wacko and still do therapy with people, but when you're teaching people about mental well-being, the mental well-being that you're coming from is the power behind what you can say and do with someone. So if you're in your head and there's no, I mean, I always think that when we're in our head, we're kind of in the dead thought cemetery. There's no life there, that there's no awakeness, there's no quietness there, there's no way to touch someone. But when we come from that deeper state, a deeper feeling of mental well-being, that's what draws it out of people. So being able to see that, but also being able to be in that feeling. So it's kind of like it's the tool we use, it's the medium we use, it's the result that we're looking for. It's all the same thing. So I really work with my students to live in a state of mind that's quieter, to kind of take themselves on and their own insecurities on, and just live in a nicer feeling. And I've learned to do that more gracefully as I've gotten older.
A little softer around it.
A little softer. So I still, the thing is, the feeling I have is pretty strong, so I have to really temper it. And I didn't realize that. I kind of didn't understand that about myself, because I was just in my head, I wasn't being that intense. But so yeah, I've had to learn to really be gentle with people and be loving with people, and also be firm with people. So whatever seems to work in the moment is what I do. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about their understanding of the principles, it's also being a good therapist, you know. So if you write a report and I don't think it's very good, I'll have to redo it. And it's, you know, sometimes people think that when you learn the principles, it's all about being positive and being kind of happy all the time, but it's just being really competent. So, you know, one of the things when I was thinking about what we might talk about was that in looking at people and dealing with the world, I think that's where sometimes people struggle. It's like, how do I come from the principles and then deal with this world that's really outside in? Is kind of learning how to talk another language to me. And I find that fascinating. Like, I find it really interesting to see how I can talk to somebody about doing something different with a client and have them understand it. And I used to think like, oh, they're never going to understand this, or they're going to think I'm weird, or they're going to see how different this is. And I'd scare myself with it, right? And so now I just like talk from what I know about what's going on with people. And I tend to look at people like like people say, well, how can you diagnose people, and how can you like deal with the insurance companies and all that kind of stuff? Well, to me, the level of consciousness a person is at is really what the diagnosis is. You're just writing down how insecurity comes out in people in this moment. It doesn't mean, in my mind, they're going to stay there. Now, somebody else might think that, but I don't think that. So I don't have an issue with that. Like, okay, I do a lot of adjustment disorders, I'll tell you. I look at people as, you know, adjusting to their thinking, adjusting to life. But I mean, I have some pretty sick kind of behavior people. And when I deal with the courts, especially about it, they're not really interested in hearing about the principles. So you learn to like focus on how they're changing, what's different, and also see them as they are. You know, so you're looking at people as they're functioning in their life without judgment. Then you can do it in a way that is helpful to the client.
And I think that that is really profound, because I know on some of these other webinars there's been conversations about how to make that, balance that out between a traditional psychological approach in the world and the, you know, the practice of insurance and so forth. But it sounds like you've been able to navigate that really beautifully, and not compromise in any way the understanding that you have and what you're pointing people towards. And you've talked about the feeling a few times, and I know that you know, looking for feeling, like that comes up a lot in the conversation around the understanding. And I'd just love it if you could share more about what that means to you and how you relate to that.
Well, what came to my mind was this, is when mind comes through us, it's an incredible experience, and it comes in many different forms. But when it comes through you, you're able to draw that out of the person you're talking to. So the feeling that you're in is a quiet, deep, loving feeling, but it can also be an alive and happy and in the moment kind of feeling. So like a lot of times I think people try to, like, I remember I did, okay, I gotta be really high now. I gotta talk from a high level of consciousness, you know, and it just gotta be yourself. I mean, that's what Sid told me, right? Just be yourself, and then you talk from the feeling in you. And when you awaken to that feeling, you get the feel of it. Like, it's like kind of like riding a horse, you know, it's like you get on and you gotta see how to connect with the horse. But to me, it's like just coming from that mind as it comes through me. It's just, I'm just talking from that, and I'm not thinking about what else I want to say or anything. It's just, it comes through, and sometimes it doesn't even make sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to my client, but they hear something happens, because it's not in the words. It's in the feeling, the energy, the power of mind. That then insight comes to clients. Insight comes to other people. And I'll tell you, most often what I hear from my clients is that the insights they get that are the most powerful are things I say off the cuff. You know, because like when I'm like doing therapy with them, they're a little bit insecure. And they're like, it's this thing that's happening between us. And then when everybody's kind of like not trying to get better and I'm not trying to help them, it's like this feeling changes and there's something else that happens. So it's just being like, Linda Pransky talks about this a lot, and she said it's just like two people having a conversation. And the more you're doing that, but if you're living in a state of being where your feeling is different, then whatever you say will be different. That's what I saw when we walked. That's how I learned from Sid, is that he would talk about nothing and my life would change, you know, and it would, and so I knew it wasn't him doing it, right? It's like he wasn't doing anything to me, but something happened, and there's that magical spiritual thing that happens when we connect up with that feeling in us. And there's no other way to describe it, because I remember I did the same thing. Like, what are you talking about? What feeling are you talking about? You're talking about being happy. You're talking about like being like, oh my God, this is so new and exciting. Like, what is it you're talking about? And to me, it's a feeling of presence where you are mind, and it's not about the words coming from you, but you are something deeper than that.
Mm. That's really beautifully said. And I really appreciate that recognition that it's inside, because, you know, I never got to meet Sidney Banks. Many of us will never, you know, didn't get to meet him, but it doesn't matter, because what he was pointing to is who we all are. And that there's a gift in learning from him in terms of the ability to point in the way that he was pointing and to have that, but ultimately it's right there for all of us, is what I hear and what you're saying.
Yeah. You know that after I went to that first weekend, at this time in life, there were no books, there was nothing to listen to, there was no internet, there was no way of really hearing him. But Joel Bailey had two audio tapes. He gave me one. It was called Seminar on Mental Health. And he was talking to therapists. So I would go to work and do therapy with my clients, and then I'd go home at night and I'd listen to that. And I'd think, oh man, I didn't do that right. Oh gosh, I took him back in the past there. But to this day, preparation for me is listening to Sydney Banks. And that the beautiful thing for people that didn't meet him is that he is just as alive on his videotapes, because it's not him, wasn't him then. And he really fought hard to teach us that it wasn't him. And to not, he just did not take any, like, people getting too attached to him. He was not interested in having followers. He was not interested in having people emulate him. But I remember that first month when that's all I had was that tape, is after he talks with the Canadian A. And so after all, I went to do the group, and I'd say A, and I was like, oh gosh, oh my gosh, I got to stop listening to that tape, right? Because then you can also get into this, like, okay, Sid is going to fix me. This tape is going to fix me. And then you lose it. It has no power then, because it has nothing to do with him.
Mm-hmm.
It only has to do with what's in you.
Yeah.
And the more you let that out, and the more you go with that in your own life, you'll see how to be the best therapist you can be.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's like I mean, I've been now doing this every day of my life practically since I learned about it in 1980, and I'm still learning. I mean, like this, when I did this intensive this weekend, I thought, oh, I could have done that differently. I could have done this differently. I thought, yep, could have done that. So it's you know, it's like just continually, I mean, that's really, that makes, I mean, one of the things that makes this understanding so awesome is that you can be a therapist as long as I've been a therapist and not be burned out about it,
Mm-hmm.
not be jaded, not be like, oh God, another client, oh God, you know, another same old problems. I mean, I hear my colleagues when I have to go to training, you know, they're like, oh, aren't you bored doing therapy after these years? I'm like, bored? You gotta be kidding me. This is the most exciting thing in the world. And they're like, what are you doing? I said, well, you know, I'm doing this stuff with principles, and it's really, I keep learning. It's the best thing since chicken soup. And I said, you find another therapist doing any kind of traditional work who's as jazzed about what they do as I am, and I'll take a look at that. But I don't think you're going to find anybody.
No. Yeah, that's so hopeful. Debbie has her hand raised, so let me just unmute you, Debbie. Hi, Debbie.
Hey, thanks so much. This has been awesome. I have a quick question. I am also a facilitator and have someone I love dearly, a dear friend who has relapsed from mental health issues as well as drug and alcohol issues. So I would just love your insights around relapse, and I want to see something really different in it.
Well, I think when people relapse, they just get caught back up in their thinking. They don't know it. And then when you go back to that level of consciousness, see, if you look at people as coming from a level of consciousness, so whatever level you're at, your thinking, your behaviors, all that's going to come from that state of mind. So when you get better, your state of mind moves, all of this changes automatically. Well, when you go back, it's still back there. And if you don't see that, how thought works, you can get back to it. So a lot of times when people relapse, I see that as it's time for them to go deeper. And they didn't know it. So they kind of go back a little bit in the past. Like, it's always seemed to me like it is a little bit like pole vaulting. So when you want to like go over the next level, you have to go back a little bit. And I don't see relapse as being a bad thing, because I'll tell you, when people go back to using drugs, that their mental health issues always go back. And it doesn't matter which one triggers it. It's just that it like, if you think of it, like they have one foot in the basement and then they start sobering up and the other foot's going up the stairs, and you get to this place where you can't go up anymore. And so all of a sudden you're like, whoop, back down to the ground again.
Yeah, yeah.
So it just means that both feet got to come up and they got to really, really just go deeper in their own understanding of mental well-being.
I love that. It's so beautiful. And I've seen that time and time again. You know, that relapse can really lead to, number one, an increased recovery and deeper insights. But, you know, I'm curious from a loved one / facilitator perspective, besides seeing that myself, any insights around showing up differently?
You just got to listen to your wisdom. That's the thing, is nobody else knows what you should do but you know.
Yeah.
You see, but this is a good example, is because what we do is we go into memory to try to figure out what to do, and then there's nothing there, right? Because you don't know. So you have to be totally okay with not knowing, trusting that as you go towards love for this person,
Yeah.
that if there is something for you to do, it'll come to you.
It's exactly right. And it happened so beautifully tonight, because everything I was seeing from the natural perspective was like, oh, this is not good. And then at that moment I prayed and I said, I just want to see something different in this, Lord. And within an instant, my heart just got this compassion burst of, she's doing the best she can right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, all of a sudden the tears just started pouring down. I was like, okay, yep. And that's what I needed to see differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And
you see,
you know,
we have a lot of thinking about relapse, so it's easy to get caught up in that because we get afraid for the person, right?
yeah.
And then we start thinking, oh, we got to fix this problem so they can get their health. But it's backwards. They have to just find their health at a deeper level, and then they'll sober up.
Yeah. So beautiful.
Yeah.
So beautiful. And yeah, perfect insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks.
Sending lots of love to your loved one. So Chris, we're just about at time. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the group before we finish up?
You know, just be you. Just be you and keep going deeper. Just keep listening and listen to yourself. You know, there's a lot of teachers around, there's a lot of things to do, but really, you're the best teacher you'll ever get. Sometimes not very graceful, but you will be the best teacher you ever had. And the more you're open to that, and the more you take yourself in personally, like the more you don't care about yourself in a sense, the easier it is to change. It's like we just take ourselves personal. And
yeah, say a little bit more about taking yourself in personally. I love that statement.
well, you know, the more you don't care, like I had a huge issue with kind of judging myself and being hard on myself. And when I was working in Des Moines, Iowa, and with another facilitator, we'd go down and do these trainings and do this stuff. And afterwards, we had these evaluations that we did. And she said, oh, I can't wait to look at the evaluations. I was like, what? And she said, like, yeah, I can't wait to look at them. I was like, why would you want to look at that? And she said, because I want to see if there's anything new that I can learn. And I thought, well, it's already done and over with. So whatever it was that we could learn is not going to happen again. And that's ridiculous. She goes, yeah, I know, but there might be something that people say that I could get an insight from. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a much better way of looking at it. I thought, I am so caught up in my ego, my own personal thinking about myself, that I can't just hear it as an impersonal information. So for me, like if I get caught up in I get stressed out, it's not personal. Like I'm not a bad person. My understanding of the principles hasn't gone away. I'm not a bad teacher. I mean, these are just ways that we think negatively about ourselves, and then we personalize our own understanding. We personalize it, and that's just that insecure thinking.
Yeah, make it mean something.
So the more you don't care about it, it's like, like now I get stressed out, and like, in fact, yesterday I got stressed out. I was like, I'm doing this thing with my dogs where I'm doing scent work, where I train them how to find scents, and we have a big thing coming up on the 21st. And I got this note saying, if you haven't registered, you won't make it because we're full. And I was like, oh, I don't remember registering. And then I got like, oh my God, I'm gonna miss this. Oh my God, I gotta get a hold of somebody. I thought, Chris, you are totally nuts right now. That's interesting. So it's like, that's interesting to me. Like, I don't care that happened. And then I get home and I'm emailing people, and they're like, yes, Chris, you're registered. It's like, oh, thank God. I totally scared myself. And so people are laughing at me. They think that's really funny because I'm just me. I just don't care. I don't care anymore what other people think, and I don't care that I did that. I used to like never tell that to anybody, for God's sake. I mean, oh my God. But it's like, who cares? It's another good story for my clients.
The humanness, right?
So those stories I have are some of the best ones, and that's because I have feeling behind it. I saw something different.
Yeah, that's so freeing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and spending that with us today. And do you have any programs coming up that you'd like to let people know about?
Actually, I'm going to be doing a day and a half in Minnesota, the 25th and 26th of October. And I have something else going too. What else do I have? No, I don't. We're going to have a training in Hawaii, but we haven't finalized the dates yet. But it's probably going to be in February.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. So that's happening, and we always try to do it at places where people can really slow down and really just get into the beauty. And the thing about Hawaii is that the culture is kind of the Hawaiian culture is based on aloha, which is really their way of identifying mental well-being in people. So there's lots of avenues to take, but it's also the most beautiful place on the planet. So it's hard to not get a good feeling.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you once again.